Before we go further, let me tell you something. If you maji ichiri, this channel was maji for you. This is where we go deep into Jungian psychology, into the philosophy of self-knowledge, into everything that helps us understand why we added the way we add without judgment, without simplification. If you want to keep having this kind of conversation, the one that does need to happen at the dinner table, but that you need to have subscribed to the channel, hit the bell, because the next video might be exactly what you need to hear right now. You have been an adult for a long time. You have the responsibilities, the relationships, the professional history, the accumulated experience of someone who has navigated the world with at least partial competence for years or decades. And then something happens, a specific kind of conflict, a specific quality of pressure, a specific person or situation that carries some combination of elements that you cannot yet name. The adult disappears. What remains is not the person you have built. It is something earlier, something more reactive, something that responds to the present situation with an intensity, a logic that belongs to a different chimney. You know, somewhere, that the response is not proportionate. You can see, from whatever distance remains available, that the adult you would handle this differently. But the adult is not available. Something older has taken the wheel. Jung had a name for what just happened, and the name points to one of the most clinically significant and least understood phenomena in the psychology of adult life. Psychic regression. Jung as a term for the return to earlier psychological states under conditions of stress, conflict, or activation is not a failure of development. It is not evidence that the adult has not been adequately formed, that the work of growing up was incomplete, that something fundamental went wrong. It is, in the Jungian framework, a universal feature of the human psyche, a mechanism built into the psychological system that produces, under specific conditions, a return to earlier modes of experiencing, responding that were formed in earlier developmental moments. Every adult regresses. The question is not whether regression happens but how far back it goes, how frequently it is triggered, how long it lasts, and whether the person who experiences it understands what is happening well enough to work with it. The counterintuitive tone that Jung's framework produces about regression, the tone that is the center of this video is this. Regression is not only a problem to be prevented, it is, in its deeper function, a communication. A signal from the psyche that something unfinished from an earlier developmental moment is being activated by something either presented a complex form around an early experience, is being triggered by a present situation that carries sufficient emotional resemblance to the original to awaken the response patterns that were installed then. The regression is not random. It is specific. It goes back to the specific developmental moment where the complex was formed. In the complex, once activated, does not respond to the present situation. It responds to the original one, with the original logic, with the original intensity, with the original strategies for managing what the original situation required. The infantile complex is Jung's term for the psychic structures formed in the earliest developmental periods, before the capacity for conscious evaluation was available. Are the most powerful and the most consistently underestimated forces in adult psychology. They are formed before language, before the capacity to contextualize, before any cognitive framework was available to mediate between the experience and the response. What is installed in those early years is installed at the level of the nervous system, at the level of the body as learned responses to the fundamental questions of safety, worth, belonging, and love. And because it was installed before the capacity to evaluate it does not carry the tag that later learning carries, the tag that says this is what I learned, this may or may not be true, this can be examined. Each carries a different quality, the quality of simply how things are. This video is about psychic regression in the infantile complex as the adult life, not as failures of maturity, but as the psyche's most persistent, most honest communications about what remains unfinished. Where the complexes form, how they operate in adult relationships in professional life, what triggers the regression, what the adult who is watching themselves regress can do with that observation, what Jung understood about the work of integrating the infantile complex that transforms each from a force that takes over the adult self into a dimension of the psyche that the adult self knows and can, increasingly, choose how to respond to. The infantile complex forms at the intersection of three elements: the child's innate temperament, the specific emotional environment of the original family system, e the archetypal expectations that every child brings to the earliest developmental encounters. The temperament determines the child's sensitivity, how intensely experiences are registered, how deeply the emotional logic of the environment is absorbed, how the nervous system responds to the fundamental relational questions of the earliest years. The environment provides the specific answers to those questions through the presence or absence of caregivers, through the consistency or inconsistency of emotional availability, through what was received and what was not, what was safe to express and what produced withdrawal or danger. In the archetypal layer, the innate predispositions that precede any specific experience provides the template against which the environment's answers are measured. The most important characteristic of infantile complex formation is its preverbal, precognitive quality. The learning that produces the infantile complex does not happen through reasoning or through the conscious evaluation of experience. It happens through the direct absorption of the emotional atmosphere, through the repeated experience of what produces safety, what produces danger, what generates the warmth of genuine reception, what generates the specific coldness of not being received, what the child must do to maintain the connection that its survival depends on, what threatens that connection. This learning is not stored as memory in the conventional sense. It is stored as the body's learned responses, as the nervous system's automatic reactions to specific combinations of relational signals, as the preconscious knowledge of what a situation means before the conscious mind has had time to evaluate it. Picture the formation of a specific infantile complex with precision. A child of 2 or 3 who discovers, through the accumulated weight of repeated experience rather than through any single event, that the expression of certain emotions, anger, disappointment, the direct assertion of need produces in the primary caregiver a response that is experienced as withdrawal, as cooling, as the reduction of the warmth that constitutes the child's emotional survival. The child does not consciously decide to suppress these emotions. This suppression happens at a level prior to decision, as the automatic learning of which expressions are safe and which are not, installed with the efficiency of a survival system that does not have the luxury of deliberation. In the complex that forms around this learning, the psychic structure organized around the belief that certain emotions are not safe, that direct need assertion threatens connection, that the self must be managed to maintain belonging or operate in the adult's relationships with the same logic and the same automatic quality decades later. This specific intensity of an infantile complex is proportional to 2 factors: the developmental lineage of its formation and the degree to which it organized around a fundamental survival question. The earlier the learning was installed, the more completely preverbal, the more dependent the child was on the relationship where the learning occurred, the more deeply it is embedded, and the more total its activation tends to be. In the more the complex organized around the fundamental questions: am I safe? Am I loved? Do I belong? Am I adequate? The more the activation of the complex tends to produce responses that are total rather than partial, that engage the whole nervous system rather than just the conscious mind, that have the quality of an emergency even when the present situation does not, objectively, constitute one. Jung was explicit about the universality of infantile complex formation not as a pathology but as the inevitable consequence of the child's developmental situation, the total dependency, the precognitive learning, the formation of the psyche in a specific relational environment that could not possibly fulfill all the archetypal expectations the child brought to it. Every child forms infantile complexes. The question is not their presence but their intensity, their specific content, in the degree to which the adult who carries them has developed enough relationship with them to prevent their most total activatures from operating completely outside conscious awareness. Regression in adult life does not always look like a tantrum or a breakdown, the obvious forms that most people associate with the concept of regression to an earlier state. More often it looks like something subtler, a quality of response that is slightly off, is slightly more intense than the situation warrants, slightly less flexible than the person's usual range, slightly more organized around themes that belong to a much earlier period than the present one. The partner who suddenly sounds, in the middle of a conflict, like they are 12 years old, not in their vocabulary but in the specific emotional logic of what they are saying, what they need. The professional who, in the presence of a particular kind of authority, becomes someone who cannot access their own competence, not because the competence has disappeared but because something in the presence of the authority has activated a state in which the competence is not available. The person who, in a specific relational configuration, loses access to the adult capacities they reliably have in every other context. The most recognizable signature of regression is the disproportionate response, the emotional reaction that is larger than the present situation justifies, that carries a quality of urgency or intensity that exceeds what the objective circumstances require. Jung was consistent on this point across his clinical work. Disproportionate responses are almost always the signature of complex activation. The proportion that belongs to the present situation is the adult's genuine response. The proportion that exceeds the situation belongs to the complex, to the infantile state that has been activated by the present triggering, that is responding not to the present situation but to the original one. The total response is the sum of the two. In the adult who has not developed the capacity to distinguish between them experiences the total response as simply their reaction as what the situation produced, rather than as what the situation plus the complex produced. There are several specific forms of regression in adult life that are worth naming separately because they are so common and so consistently not recognized as regression. The first is what might be called the demand regression. The adult who, in the presence of a specific need or desire that is not being met, shifts from the adult's capacity to negotiate and communicate the need into the child's mode of demanding, sulking, or withdrawing the strategies that were available before the adult's relational vocabulary was developed. The demand regression is particularly common in intimate relationships, where the proximity and the dependency activate the earliest relational patterns with the most force. The second is the authority regression. The adult who, in the presence of a figure that activates the parental complex, shifts from their usual adult competence into the child's mode of either compliance or defiance, the two positions that were available in the original authority relationship. The third form of regression is the one that is most psychologically interesting because each is the least obviously regressive, is what Jung called the retreat to the unconscious. The regression that does not produce visible emotional behavior, but that produces a withdrawal from adult engagement, a return to fantasy, a retreat into the inner world of the child's imagination as a way of managing a present that feels too demanding for the adult's current resources. This form of regression is often misidentified as introversion, as creativity, as the legitimate need for solitude, in which it can be all of these things. But when the retreat is organized around avoidance rather than renewal, when it is triggered specifically by the demands that adult life makes rather than by the genuine need for restoration, it has the quality of regression rather than of recovery. Picture the specific texture of an adult life in which regression is a frequent and not yet understood visitor. A woman in her late 30s who is, by every external measure, a fully functional adult, competent professionally, thoughtfully her friendships, capable of genuine reflection about her own psychology. A who finds that in the context of her most intimate relationship, a specific combination of elements, her partner's withdrawal, a certain quality of emotional distance, the specific sensation of not being fully received, produces in her a state that she recognizes when she can observe it as not kit hers, a quality of need that is more total than she experiences in any other context. A certainty that the distance means something fundamental about her worth that her adult self would not endorse. A set of strategies, pursuit, escalation, these specific forms of demand that she knows are counterproductive, that she cannot prevent herself from deploying even as she watches herself deploy them. That is the infantile complexity operation. The woman watching herself is not failing to be an adult. She is experiencing one of the most honest features of the adult psyche, the infantile complex activating in the specific relational context that most resembles its original formation. Before we continue, let me say something. If you've stayed this far, you already know this channel is for you. We go deep into Jungian psychology, into the philosophy of self-knowledge, into everything that helps us understand why we are the way we are without judgment, without simplification. If you want to keep having this kind of conversation, the one that does need to happen at the dinner table, but that you need to have subscribed to the channel, hit the bell, because the next video might be exactly what you need to hear right now. Jung's concept of the inner child, which has been so thoroughly absorbed into popular psychology that it has lost much of its original precision, was not, its original formulation, a sentimental concept. It was a clinical one. The inner child, in Jung's framework, is not a metaphor for innocence or for the unlived potential of the genuine self, though each can contain those things. Each is the psychic structure that preserves the adult psychology, the emotional logic, the relational strategies, and the fundamental beliefs about self in world that were formed in the earliest developmental period. Each is not imaginary. Each is a functional part of the adult psyche, a part that has its own perspective, its own emotional responses, its own needs and fears that operates most visibly when the adult is under conditions that resemble the conditions under which each was formed. The inner child's perspective is not wrong, it is simply organized around a reality that no longer exists. The child who learned that emotional expression was dangerous was responding accurately to an environment in which emotional expression was, in fact, dangerous. The child who learned that the way to maintain connection was to suppress need was learning the most effective strategy available in the specific environment they were navigating. The child who learned that achievement was the condition of worth was absorbing the emotional logic of the specific system they depended on for survival. None of these learnings were errors. They were the intelligent responses of a developing psyche to the specific conditions of its formation. The problem is not that the learning was wrong then. The problem is that each continues to operate now, in an environment that has changed, as if the conditions that match the strategy necessary were still present. The most clinically significant aspect of the inner child's operation in adult life is its tendency to misidentify present figures with original ones, to project the emotional significance of the early caregiver onto the present partner, the authority figure's meaning onto the present boss, the sibling's role onto the present colleague or friend. This misidentification is not conscious. Each is the automatic operation of the pattern recognition system that the infantile complex embodies, the system that scans the present environment for combinations of signals that match the original patterning. When each finds them, activates the original response. The present person disappears momentarily behind the projected image. The adult responds not to who is actually there but to who the complex sees in the present person's place. There is a specific and important distinction between regression as a temporary state, the adult who activates, responds from the complex, and then returns to adult functioning, and regression as a more chronic condition, in which the infantile complex has become so thoroughly integrated into the adult's identity that the distinction between the adult's genuine perspective and the complex's perspective is no longer visible. The chronically regressive adult does not experience themselves as regressive. They experience their complex's perspective as simply their perspective, as the accurate and reasonable assessment of a self that is, fundamentally, what the infantile one said it was. This chronic condition is not more pathological than the temporary activation. It is simply more invisible and therefore more difficult to work with, because the first requirement of working with the complex is the capacity to observe it as a complex rather than as reality. Jung was careful to distinguish between the inner child as a psychological liability, the infantile complex operating outside conscious awareness, producing regression in the misidentification of present figures with original ones, and the inner child as a psychological resource, the preserved connection to the spontaneity, the directness, the capacity for genuine emotional expression and genuine wonder that the adult world tends to require the suppression of. The integration of the infantile complex is not the elimination of the inner child. It is the development of our relationship with the child's perspective that allows the adult to access what it preserves without being governed by what it protects. It is what this looks like in a specific moment. A man whose infantile complex formed around emotional withdrawal, whose partner's distance reliably produced the total urgency of the child, whose caregiver was not available, who, in a moment of his partner's genuine tiredness in temporary distance, feels the urgency arrive as it always has. But this chimney, alongside the urgency, something else is also present. The adult's knowledge that the distance is ordinary, that each is about his partner's tiredness rather than about his worth, that the urgency belongs to an earlier chimney. Both are present simultaneously, the child's panic and the adult's perspective. He does not act from the panic. He waits. The waiting is not comfortable, but each is available in a way each was not before. It is the integration, not the absence of the child's intensity, but the presence of the adult self alongside each. Every infantile complex has a specific trigger profile, a set of relational, emotional, or situational conditions that reliably activate each. The trigger profile is not random. Each is organized around the specific emotional logic of the original formation, around the combinations of signals that most closely resemble the conditions under which the complex was installed. The person whose infantile complex form around emotional unavailability will be triggered most reliably by present-day experiences of emotional distance, by the partner who withdraws, by the friend who does not respond, by the colleague who is present body but absent attention. The person whose complex formed around conditional worth will be triggered most reliably by evaluation, by the presence of someone whose regard matters and who appears to be withholding each, by the professional context where performance is being assessed, by any situation where the question of adequacy is implicitly or explicitly present. Understanding one's own trigger profile is one of the most practically significant pieces of self-knowledge available, not because triggers can be eliminated, but because triggers that are recognized can be responded to differently than triggers that are not. The unrecognized trigger activates the complex, and the complex responds to the original situation through the lens of the present one, in the person, having awareness that the activation has occurred, experiences the response as simply their reaction to the present situation. The recognized trigger does not prevent the complex from activating, but the recognition creates a small but crucial gap between the activation and the response, a moment in which the adult self can observe what is happening, can notice that the complex is active, and can, at least sometimes, bring a perspective to the situation that is not entirely organized by the complex logic. The most common trigger for infantile complex activation in adult life is not dramatic crisis, but ordinary relational friction, the small, repeated experiences of not being fully received, not being fully understood, not being fully seen, that add the inevitable texture of any genuine relationship between two people, who are each carrying their own complexes in their own blind disputes. The small friction activates the complex. The complex responds with the logic of the original one, with the intensity that belongs not to the small friction but to the original situation that the small friction resembles. In the person in the relationship experiences, with bewildering regularity, a gap between the size of the friction and the size of the response, a gap that they cannot explain by reference to the present situation alone. There is a specific irreliable pattern in how infantile complexes operate across different relational contexts that is worth learning to recognize. The complex tends to be most visible in the relationships where the person is most invested, most in love, most dependent, most genuinely connected. The relationships where the stakes are the lowest tend to activate the complex least. The relationships where the stakes are the highest, the intimate partnership, the relationship with children, the relationship with the primary authority figures in professional life activate each most. This is not coincidental. The complex was formed in the highest stakes relational context available, the relationship with the primary caregiver, where the stakes were literally survival. In the adult relationships that carry the highest stakes carry the closest emotional resemblance to the original context, which is precisely why they added the most reliable triggers. Picture the trigger pattern operating across a life. A man who is, in most professional and social contexts, patient, thoughtful, and genuinely capable of the kind of steady presence that others rely on, who finds that in the context of his marriage, a specific trigger consistently produces a state that he does not recognize as his own. When his wife expresses disappointment, not anger, specifically disappointment, something happens before he can prevent it. A quality of shame arrives that is disproportionate to the disappointment she has expressed. A defensive response activates before his adult self has evaluated whether a defense is warranted. The subsequent behavior, withdrawal, or counter-criticism, or the specific over-explanation that is organized around reversing the shame rather than addressing what produced the disappointment, is not what his adult self would choose. And he knows this. He can see it happening. But the seeing, without the understanding of what is being activated and why, is not sufficient to change the pattern. The pattern belongs to the complex, and the complex is responding not to his wife's disappointment. It is responding to a disappointment that was expressed in a different room, by a different person, a very long time ago. The territory where regression is most consequential, and most consistently not named as regression, is intimate relationships, because intimate relationships are the context that most reliably activates the earliest infantile complexes. The proximity, the dependency, the genuine vulnerability of loving someone and needing to be loved. Return these conditions added the closest adult approximation of the original conditions under which the infantile complexes were formed. And when the complex is activated in this territory, the stakes feel correspondingly total, not because the adult relationship is actually as existentially significant as the original one, but because the complex does not distinguish between the two. Each responds to both with the same quality of fundamental urgency. The most common form of regression in intimate relationships is what might be called the positional regression. The adult who, in the context of a conflict or a relational stress, shifts from the adult's capacity for mutual engagement into one of the two positions that were available in the original parental relationship: the child who complies or the child who defies. These two positions feel, from the inside, like very different responses. One is organized around accommodation, the other around resistance, but they are structurally identical. Both are organized around the other person's power rather than around the person's own genuine perspective. The compliant adult is not agreeing because they genuinely agree. The defiant adult is not disagreeing because they genuinely disagree. Both are responding to the complex experience of power differential, the child's experience of being in relationship with someone whose response is experienced as determining the child's safety. In professional contexts, regression tends to organize itself specifically around the authority relationship, the relationship with bosses, supervisors, institutional structures, and any figure whose evaluation carries the emotional weight of the parental figure's assessment. The professional who becomes, in the presence of a specific type of authority, someone who cannot access their own competence, who over-explains, who apologizes preemptively, who produces work and then undermines each before each can be evaluated, is experiencing the authority regression. Picture what this looks like in a specific meeting. A senior analyst who has prepared thoroughly, who knows her material, who enters the room with a clear position and who finds, when the director begins to question her conclusions, that something shifts before she can prevent it. Not the ordinary adjustment of someone receiving new information. Something more total, her certainty becoming suddenly provisional, her position qualifying itself before the director has finished his objection, her voice dropping half a register. She leaves the meeting having conceded points she did not genuinely concede. Having agreed to revisions she does not actually think at improvements. Later, alone, she knows exactly what she should have said. The competence was never absent. The authority regression made temporarily unavailable, replacing the professional with the child who learned, in a different room with a different authority, that having a position that differed from the powerful figures was not safe. There is a third domain where regression operates with particular significance: the relationship with one's own children. The parent who finds themselves responding to their child's behavior with an intensity that they recognize, in their more reflective moments, as not being entirely about the child, who finds that the child's tantrum, or the child's refusal, or the child's demand activates something in them that is older than the parenting who is experiencing what Jung understood as one of the most important psychological challenges of parenthood: the activation of one's own infantile complex by the child's infantile state. The parent who cannot tolerate the child's anger is often the adult who could not tolerate their own angry childhood. The parent who cannot allow the child's dependency is often the adult whose own dependency was not adequately received. The parent is not failing. They are being invited, by their child's most ordinary developmental behavior, into the work of their own complex. The cost of unexamined regression in relationships work is not primarily the dramatic cost, not the relationship that ends, the career that derails, the crisis that makes the problem visible and unavoidable. The more significant cost is the chronic cost, the continuous, low-level expenditure of energy required to manage the complex activities without understanding them, to repair the relational damage that the regressions produce, to maintain the adult self-s functioning in the face of the complex repeated intrusions. This chronic cost is what produces the specific exhaustion that is not resolved by rest, the exhaustion of a person who is working very hard, in the background of their adult life, to manage a force that they have not yet been able to name. Chapter 7 Working with THI Infantile Complex. Working with the infantile complex in the Jungian sense of developing enough conscious relationship with each to reduce the automatism of its operation is not the work of eliminating the complex or of becoming someone who no longer regresses. It is the work of developing, gradually with appropriate patience, the capacity to observe the complex activation as it is happening to create the gap between the trigger and the response that allows the adult self to be present in the situation rather than entirely absent from it, replaced by the child's state. This gap, which begins as a barely perceptible pausing, develops, with consistent work, into a more reliable space of conscious choice, is the primary achievement of the work. Each does not resolve the complex, it changes the relationship with it. The first movement of the work is the mapping of the trigger profile of the patient, no judgmental observation of the conditions that most reliably produce the regression. This requires the willingness to look honestly at the pattern across contexts, to resist the explanation that organizes each activation as a separate, situationally justified response, and to ask the question that the pattern demands: what is the same in these situations? What specific combination of relational signals produces, in me, a state that I recognize as not entirely adult? The mapping is not a comfortable exercise because the trigger profile points directly at the infantile complex. In the infantile complex, by definition, is organized around experiences that the adult self would prefer not to revisit, but the precision that the mapping produces is irreplaceable as the foundation of the subsequent work. The second movement is the development of what Jung called the observing ego, the capacity to watch the complex activation without being entirely consumed by it. This is the capacity that the woman watching herself pursue, escalate, and deploy the counterproductive strategies she knows are counterproductive is attempting to exercise the capacity to be both inside the activation and outside each simultaneously, to be feeling the complex urgency while also registering that the urgency belongs till the complex rather than entirely till the present situation. The observing ego does not stop the activation. It provides a witness, and the witness, over time, produces the gap that makes choice possible. The first time the gap appears the first moment in which the adult self manages to say, inside the activation, this is older than this situation is one of the most significant moments available in genuine psychological work. The third movement is the dialogue with the inner child, the deliberate, compassionate engagement with the perspective of the infantile complex, not to validate the child's assessment of the present situation, but to understand the original experience that produced the assessment. This dialogue is not imaginary in a trivial sense. It is the adult self's genuine attempt to understand what the child learned, in what context, in response to what specific experiences to bring the adult's capacity for contextualizing and evaluating to a learning that was installed before those capacities were available. The understanding that this dialogue produces does not erase the complex. It humanizes, it transforms it from an automatic force operating in the background into a perspective that can be recognized, understood, in its most acute activatures, gently corrected by an adult self that knows what the child does not, that the present situation is not the original one. The fourth movement, and the one that Jung considered most essential for genuine integration, is the grieving of what the infantile complex was formed around. The child who learned that emotional expression was dangerous did not simply learn a strategy. They lost something: the freedom to express directly, the experience of being fully received, the emotional dimensions that the environment could not hold. The child who learned that worth was conditional lost something too: the experience of being adequate prior to performance, of being loved for existing rather than for achieving. The grief of these losses, real grief, not the intellectual acknowledgement of them but the felt experience of what the formation of the complex cost, is the prerequisite for the genuine integration that allows the adult to carry the complex history without being organized by its conclusions. The grief is not the destination. Each is the passage, and what becomes available on the other side of each is what the next chapter describes. There is a specific quality that emerges in the adult who has done genuine work with their infantile complexes, a quality that is not the absence of regression or the elimination of the child's perspective from the adult's psychology. Each is something more interesting than either of those things. Each is the quality of a person who contains their history rather than being contained by each, who can feel the child's urgency without being operated by each, who can recognize the complex SE activation without being entirely disappeared by each, who can be in the present situation while also knowing what from the past is presenting their perspective. This quality, this dual awareness is not achieved once and maintained permanently. Each is practiced, imperfectly with regular failures, as one of the ongoing disciplines of a genuinely examined adult life. Jung understood the work of integrating the infantile complexes as one of the central tasks of what he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming more fully oneself, of developing a psychology that includes rather than excludes, that knows rather than suppresses, that can hold the full range of the human experience rather than managing the parts that are the most threatening. The adult who has integrated their infantile complex does not become someone different. They become more completely the person they already were, with access to the energy that was being consumed in managing the complex activities, with a relationship with their own history that allows them to be informed by each without being determined by each. The paradox at the center of regression psychology, the paradox that Jung's framework reveals, is that the adult who is most afraid of the child's state is usually the adult most organized around avoiding regression. Therefore the adult most reliably produced by each in conditions of sufficient stress. The work of integration does not begin with the decision to stop regressing. Each begins with the decision to know what the regression is about, to develop enough relationship with the infantile complex that its activation is recognizable rather than invisible, comprehensible rather than simply shameful, something that can be worked with rather than something that must be suppressed or overcome. The adult who knows their child is not more childlike than the adult who has suppressed the child. They are more whole. The relationship between the adult self and the inner child, when each is a genuine relationship rather than either a suppression or a capitulation, has a specific quality that Jung described as the conjunctio, the union of opposites, the integration of what was separated, the development of a psychology that can hold both the adult's hard-won competence and the child's immediate emotional truth without either canceling the other. The adult who has achieved even a partial version of this integration is not someone who has resolved their psychology. They are someone who has developed enough relationship with its unresolved dimensions to live with them more consciously, to be the adult who knows the child, who can hear the child's communication without being governed by the child's conclusions, who can offer the child what each needed and did not receive without expecting the present world to provide each. If you recognized yourself in this video, in the description of the disproportionate response, this specific trigger, the adult who disappears in a particular relational context, then what this video offers is not a technique for preventing the regression. Each is an invitation to know each. To ask, with the curiosity that the adult self can bring, that the child's state does not have access to, what the regression is communicating, what unfinished business from an earlier developmental moment is being activated by something either present, what the child who is briefly present in your adult response was trying to manage, you what each needed that each did not fully receive. The adult who can ask these questions not perfectly, not without the complex interference, but with the consistent intention of understanding rather than suppressing, is doing the most important work available in a genuinely examined life. If this video touched something you hadn't been able to name before, tell me in the comments. It doesn't have to be much. One sentence is enough to say, I feel this too. If you want to continue this conversation about who you are, why you feel what you feel, and how to become more whole, subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next videos, because the next conversation we're going to have might be about something you've also been carrying for a long time. Thank you for staying. Until next time.